Welcome to Lancefield on the Line. Here with me today is royalty in the world of advisors and management thinkers. Whitney Johnson is the CEO of Disruption Advisors and one of the 10 leading management thinkers in the world, again, as ranked by Thinkers 50 in 2021. You work day in, day out with CEOs, entrepreneurs, and their executive teams, giving them a rare combination of understanding how organizations work, investors think, and coaches coach. If that wasn't enough, you're a multi-best-selling author and a top voice on LinkedIn with more followers than I could even count. Of course, we're here to talk about the insights and the actions and the implications of your new book, and it's a brilliant book, Smart Growth with Tabs. These are real tabs where I've been reading through it in detail, called Smart Growth, How to Grow Your People, How to Grow Your People to Grow Your Company. And I love that coherence between the two, and people-centered strategy, people-centered organization success. And it is incisive, it is succinct, it is substantive. It's a beautifully written book, packed full of strategies, tests, challenges, and even some sections at the back of each section are colored differently, indeed, for these implications for the smart growth leaders. And there's a lot of emphasis, I'd say, on empowerment, actually taking control and taking charge of your career and indeed your life, and actually a positivity and an optimism, which I think is refreshing, particularly in these times. You're coming in, I believe, from Lexington in Virginia in the US, where you grow various berries to make jam. And very importantly, you are a runner, as you talk about in your book, starting on 5Ks and moving on from that. Many congratulations for your impact, everything you do and who you are. And I'm very welcome to the show. So please, I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. Thank you.
David, I am so happy to be here, and I appreciate that very thoughtful introduction. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. So, of course, we're going to talk about personal development, disruption, and mastery of the S-curve or S-curves, and how you apply it for real. So I want this to be practical as well as thoughtful. Now, you talk, and I quote, about the process through which humans change and ultimately chart their own destiny can be analyzed and replicated, hence the S-curve of learning, which involves 3 stages: launch, sweet spot, and mastery, and indeed 6 roles that I've been playing out in my head for days and days since reading your book: explorer, collector, accelerator, metamorph, anchor, and mountaineer. So a very simple question to start off with, and I know every individual and context is different, but which of those 6 roles do you find in your work with CEOs and others is the hardest to master?
I think it's a toss-up. Coming in second place is going to be explorer, which is at the launch point of the S-curve. And the reason I think that place is very challenging is that whenever you are doing something new and you are exploring, figuring out if you want to be in this place, if you are an achiever, probably most of your guests are achievers, and if you are insecure in any way, and most of us are insecure in some way, we want to move off of the launch point as quickly as possible because we created this open loop that feels very uncomfortable for us. And so we don't want to explore very long. We don't want to collect the data we need in order to decide if, in fact, this is the curve that we want to be on. And so that is a challenge for people to be in that place of discomfort, of uncertainty, of awkwardness, of gangliness, of impatience, long enough to figure out, yes, I'm going to commit to this. And this is, in fact, the curve, the path, the trajectory that is the right trajectory for me. And my guess is if we were to start to analyze you, and I know you're interviewing me today, but if you would to talk about the transition that you have made over the past year and a half or so, you would say that you took that time to explore.
And it was deeply uncomfortable. Especially there was the inner chat in my head, which you talk about in the book in many places, but also a lot of people, I think with good intention, I'm not quite sure, sort of that focus on what are you doing? What are you achieving? What's the new title? What's the new role? And I'm like, I don't know.
Exactly. And to be in that place where you've had this identity that you used to have of I did this big, really, this really big thing, and now I don't have that identity anymore. I've got this new identity and I'm not sure what it is. That is, like you said, deeply uncomfortable for people. And so I'm going to put that place, the launch point of the curve, that explorer phase, in second place. I would argue that in first place is the place of Mountaineer. And that's when you're at the top of the S curve. That's when you are in mastery. That's where status quo lives. And you may not like what you're doing at all, but you've got these neural pathways, this super highway of habits, and it is very comfortable and habitual, and you can hate it, but it's still what you're used to.
Yes,
and so to make the decision to move from that place to do something brand new, to basically parachute off this old place to this new place, that for most people is terrifying. And that is why I have this hypothesis, David. In the United States anyway, I don't know what it is like in the UK, but in the United States, 10 to 15% of the people prior to the pandemic, so it's probably more now, lose their job or fired or laid off every year. My hypothesis is that when people lose their jobs, having lost my job myself, we know that we're on the wrong S curve. We know it's time for us to do something new, and we won't do it. And so the universe gives us a nudge.
yes.
And so that's why the top of the S curve, jumping to do something new, is in place number one, because so often in order to get us to do something new, we need to be disrupted. We need to be pushed off that curve.
So if you're one of those individuals that either loses their job, or I've seen many senior executives being jolted by a restructuring or a new CEO or chair coming into the organization and asking the question of how relevant and how strong they are as individuals in terms of their capabilities. If you want to avoid those situations of the external, if you like, jolt, and you've begun to hear about your book and you, Whitney, and what inner work can you start doing to sort of actually move from performing well, perhaps doing some what I call performance art and theatre around learning, going to lots of events, but actually not really doing much, they're just attending and participating, and actually looking at, okay, where's the next path? Where's the next curve that I can start? So how can you engineer it yourself?
Yeah, so one of the ways that you can engineer it is to say to yourself, all right, let me understand this simple visual model. And it is very simple, which makes it therefore useful. You have a consultancy background, know that there are lots of models that are very good models, but they're not very useful because they're not simple enough. Well,
I've applied and used many of them myself. Yes.
Well, this is simple enough that you can then say to yourself, all right, we've got things are changing around here. I know that I'm on this particular curve, and I either am in mastery and I'm a little bit bored, which means I'm probably subconsciously sabotaging myself a little bit. So I can wait and have them push me off the curve. Or now that I have this awareness of where I am and what is happening for me, why don't I be proactive and figure out what I'm going to do next? Now, that proactive can look like two things. It can be one where you just say, I'm just going to jump to a new curve entirely. I'm going to go to a new company. I'm going to get a new role. Or it can be, I really am stagnating. And so what if I found a way to reinvigorate myself in this current role? So I'm not at the summit, I'm at a summit, but not the summit. So I start to push myself back into that bucket of the sweet spot where people label me as a high performer. So those are the two suggestions. But in both instances, you're making that choice to act and not waiting to be acted upon.
And in a way, you have to step into new spaces, perhaps try some experiments, one of the themes of your book. And I remember taking a coaching program in the sort of my own time and my own dollar. It's actually pounds, but we'll call it dollar. And just to try it out, just to try something else to sort of spark some imagination. Actually, I absolutely loved it. But there was a few other things I tried, again, within the bounds of the role, that didn't play out, even though I was dead set on saying, right, I'm going to become this. But you have to actually do it, right? You can't just talk about it and moan to your friends or your wife or husband and so on. You actually have to step in and take action.
Yes, you do. You have to walk into the messiness. There's no
Yes,
there's no other way. You have to walk into that. But the beauty of it is two things. Number one is that oftentimes when we're willing to experiment, it doesn't take us very long to figure out that we're actually not interested in something. I mean, we can sometimes figure it out in a week and just be like, no, that really isn't for me.
yes,
And then the other thing I would argue is that even when we do something and decide not to do it, to not continue, because we're going to explore far more S curves in our life than we'll actually pursue. And let me just throw out a data point here, which I love, and is from Clayton Christensen, who was one of my mentors. The theory of disruption says that when you pursue a disruptive course, your odds of success are 6 times higher, your revenue opportunity 20 times greater. But what we don't talk about is that 6 times goes from 6% to 36%, which means there's still a 64% chance it's not going to work. So if we extrapolate to what that means for us personally, that means that we're going to try out a lot of S curves and they're not going to work for us. But no S curves ever wasted, because there's something we will have learned. If only it's just learning how to be new at something and practicing doing that, which the older we get, the more we can insulate ourselves from never doing anything new.
yes, yes. It requires a healthy degree of resilience. And in my book, resilience is about bouncing forward, not just protecting yourself along the way. I mean, quite a few people, either by design or by necessity, are reevaluating their jobs, their careers, their lives at the moment, as wherever we are in the world, coming out of some form of systemic crises, although there'll be future ones, of course. How do you feel the shape or the length of S curves in general is changing as a result of that coming out of a crisis, which has shocked organizations, shocked individuals? Does it matter? I'm not trying to make a clever point. I'm just trying to say, how much does the context for how people think and operate matter in terms of the, if you like, the shape and the length of time it takes to move up the S curve?
So let me start by saying that psychologists have shown that when we come through a period of severe stress, there is something called post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
And if you look at the neuroscience of that, you will see that when our brains acquire some stress, it creates new cells and new circuitry. So the first thing that I would say is that this period that we have just come through is prelude to, if we will let it, a period of tremendous personal and professional growth, which I think is thrilling.
I agree.
Part of that is because we have all been upended, which has given us all some stress, more than we had before. And yes, it's been hard, but it's given us this momentum, this new circuitry, and this sense and this capacity of, I could do something new if I wanted to. So I think that's very important as we think about this. So to answer your question is, I think the context does matter, absolutely, in terms of the situation that we find ourselves in. We are going to move up a curve faster or shorter. What I will say, though, is there's an optimal amount of stress, right? If it's too hard, it's the Yerkes-Dodson rule, right? If it's too hard, we'll just shut down. And if it's not hard enough, then nothing will happen either. So we need what I consider optimized stress. And if you think about the S curve itself, one of the challenges that we're having at the launch point is it feels too hard. There's almost too much stress.
Yes.
We have to work our way through it. And in the sweet spot, it's actually optimized. There's a lot of stress, but there's also a lot of competence. And in mastery, you don't have enough stress.
Yes.
And so that's why your growth stops. So I didn't quite answer your question, other than at a very high level, the context absolutely does matter in terms of creating the conditions whereby you can grow.
And if you're a leader who buys the concept and practice of post-traumatic growth in the way you described, and you're attuned to the optimal level of stress you just described as well, what conditions can you create in order for people to, in your team or your wider organization, to fly,
Yep.
depending on where they are on the S-curve, of course.
Yeah, it's a great question. So here's what I would say is that let's start with mastery, because that's the easiest and most obvious one. When you're in mastery, what's happening in your brain is that you're no longer enjoying the feel-good effects of learning. You're not getting the dopamine. You're not getting enough stress. And so what you need to help develop people when they're in mastery is they need a challenge desperately. The challenge for you as a manager is they may to you be presenting as, well, they're in the sweet spot. They're just killing it. They're doing a great job. And so you can sometimes have this mismatch where if I were to ask, how John's doing, I'm like, he's doing great. He's in the sweet spot. He's a high performer. John takes our S-curve insight tool and he's presenting in mastery, that he's got it all figured out and he's bored and he's dialing it in. And you know what's going to predict his behavior? Not what I think, what he thinks.
Indeed.
So for mastery, you want to be having those conversations early to make sure you are continuing to challenge those people. And what's great about the S-curve is it gives you a language. And let me give you just a very simple example. When we administered our tool to this company called Chatbooks, they had a number of people who had been there for several years because they loved the culture, love the company, but they're now all presenting in mastery. What happened once they understood the S-curve of learning, the chief marketing officer was able to say, oh, now I understand. It's not that I don't like Chatbooks. It's not like that I don't like you, the CEO. It's that my brain needs a challenge.
Right.
And in this instance, there wasn't a challenge for her in that organization. So she went to another organization, but then they were able to have that amicable conversation of it's not you. It's just, I got my brain. I got to go do something new.
I get it.
Okay. So I'll go through the other two more quickly. So you help people in mastery, you give them a challenge. In the sweet spot, you want to focus on them, and focus in two senses. Number one is that because they are so competent and they're a high performer, it's easy to say, let's have David do that. Let's give that to David. Let's give that to David. And all of a sudden, David has 15 things on his plate and becomes paralyzed and inefficient and ineffective. So you want to help people in your sweet spot focus, and you want to focus on them because they're doing such a good job. It's easy to ignore them. And your people at the launch point, what they need is support. Support might be training. Support is definitely words of encouragement. Like, you can do this. This is why you're here. And perhaps the most important piece is to make sure you value the fact that they are inexperienced. And when they say, hey, why do we do it like this? You don't shut them down.
Yes.
So that's the support at the launch point, focus in the sweet spot, and challenge in mastery. That's how you manage people along the different parts of the curve. There's a lot more in the book, but that's it at a high level. Yeah,
that's clarity for you. You referred beautifully throughout that to your tool, which I will share the link to and reference to. And I've played without obviously using it. I've seen the montage. Question I have is, in using this in teams, which is one of the big things you want to do, right, in terms of growing the company as opposed to just growing an individual, is how you, again, create the conditions where people will want to share and talk about their own S-curves, which may sound very simplistic, but I could tell you many, many examples of exec teams in particular, who, when you say to them, what are the objectives of the people around you? And they BS it, they guess it, but they haven't talked about it because they haven't got it. I presume that careful disclosure of where you are on your S-curve, what you need from others, is an integral ingredient of creating a bigger team impact rather than just it being private to an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I was having a conversation earlier today with a leader who says, when someone starts working for them, they say, you and I both know that you are not going to be here forever. You're just not. So you're going to be on an S-curve, and here's what it looks like. There's a launch point, sweet spot, and mastery. Let's talk about what mastery looks like for you. And when you get to mastery, maybe there'll be another curve and you want to stay here, or maybe it will be time for you to go somewhere else and jump to a new curve. What I will say to you is that when people have this as an artifact, to have that conversation, to start that conversation, it doesn't make it much safer for people of just being able to talk about this and feel like it just makes it more comfortable to do.
And you're sort of seeking out, and it comes back to your work on if you like your ecosystem around you, seeking out, if you like, support and encouragement and challenge at different stages. So you're activating others to help you, which sounds obvious, but I think the older you get in some places and some organizations, it's like, no, I need to be able to sort this out myself. Thank you. Yeah. I'll come to you exactly when I need you, which is often too late or at the wrong time.
Exactly.
I mean, I want to go back to one of the stages around the exploring, because you talk a lot about, and very eloquently about, trying to create more of a sort of childlike both optimism and curiosity to sort of explore new places and spaces. Again, I think that's intuitive, and it's a fantastic point. The question is, if you are under pressure or stale, you might think, hey, well, I haven't got time for that, or that's going to be considered a bit of a hobby. Or I don't know, I've just never done that for a long time. How do you supercharge that exploration engine with sort of childlike fascination?
Well, you start by doing what children do, which is talk about their experience out loud. And so one of the things I would say is, whether you're under pressure or out of practice, it's actually kind of the same thing, is that it's not yet automatic for you. It's not yet deliberate. And so you create space to be able to do that by talking out loud about what is happening. And that's part of what the S-curve does, is it gives you this language to be able to say, hey, everybody, we're all on an S-curve. I'm doing these new things, and I'm at the launch point of it. So let me just talk you through this out loud. And I'm trying to figure out these 2 or 3 things. And I just want to let you know that I'm doing that. Then what happens is you're normalizing the process of doing something new. And what I would say is, you want to slow down enough so that you can do it. So when you're at the launch point, everything's new, right? You're figuring it out. You're going down a new road. You've never seen that sign before. You've never seen that sign before. And everything is new, and everything is imprinting in your brain. And so you want to slow the process down enough that you can take things in. I'll give you a very specific example. So I do a podcast. I had someone say to me, I think you need a little bit of vocal coaching. I said, okay, I'll get some coaching. So I have a coach working with me. Well, there's certain words that I don't pronounce as well as I need to pronounce. And so when we're working on it, she'll have me slow down and do words really slowly. Why? So I can learn how to do it. And so I think it's the same when you're feeling under pressure, out of practice. How do you slow it down enough that you can be deliberate? And you slow it down by talking about it out loud, what you're doing, telling people that you're learning it, normalizing the fact that you're doing something new. And then remember that at the launch point, you don't have that super highway of habit. You're building a cow path. It is going to be uncomfortable, but by having that language and signaling to everybody what you're doing, they're going to give you grace. They just are, because you're showing the humility to do that. And then you're creating the space for everybody else on your team to do that as well. And one of the gifts of COVID, and there are many, is that we are giving each other a lot more grace than we used to. And we're talking out loud about the experiences that we're having much more than we used to as well.
I agree with that. And it feels more meaningful, as opposed to disclosure to brag or to make a point. It's sort of a deeper conversation. I applaud you in the book for talking about your own journey in a way where it's not just, hey, well, I had a minor setback, but hey, I'm amazingly successful, which you are. It was actually it felt meaningful for me. And that pacing point comes throughout the book, and when to go slow, fast, slow.
So David, can I give you a little bit of color on that? Because I think it's interesting about the disclosure that I did, some of my personal stories and mistakes that I've made. Is in an earlier draft of the book, I had, and you probably saw this, I talk about a friend of mine, Julie Berry, who read the book and eviscerated it. And she's the one who called that out. She said, you're being too chirpy. You're just too upbeat. And it's an important note, because on the one hand, I wanted to be positive of we could do this, we can move forward. But her point, and as you just raised, is that if you're not willing to talk about the challenges, no one trusts you.
Yes.
So I had to disclose enough that as you were reading it, you would trust what I was saying.
And I would say, as somebody who reads some management books selectively, I'm not reading them every night. I do have other things to do. That's quite rare because it often can feel quite superficial. The other thing which I thought was distinctive was around, pausing sufficiently to celebrate, not just sort of rah-rah celebration, but meaningful celebration of the journey, the skills you've learned, and also celebrating or at least learning from the failures, which I applaud as well. But let's shift gear now. I'm going to practice what I preach, or you preach, in terms of metamorphs, in terms of, how when you're trying to complete the transformation, you have to really focus and minimize distractions at the time and along the way. What are the biggest distractions that you see people having to, I don't think you can eliminate necessarily, but at least manage better in order to make that next step, in order to transform?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of micro distractions that are the biggest distractions, which is email, text. And so I'm just going to call those out, which is if you're trying to really move along an S curve and really get something done, you have to carve out time where you can think and process and execute. And so one of the things that I do is that in the morning, I don't check my email. I don't check my texts most of the time, not always. I don't do it perfectly, but most of the time I take that time in the morning, because basically your morning is the base camp of your day, of that mountain, to do things like write in my journal. What am I grateful for? Read a sacred text. Think about what I want to get done that day. Have a really clear intention so that I can say, I've got these 5 things that I am going to get done today, and I'm not going to stop working until they're done.
Yes, yes.
Did you hear my thing? Sorry about
that.
Yeah,
It's good. It sort of shook us, didn't it? But it's good.
It did.
Yeah,
it
there you go.
disrupted us. Okay.
Yeah, why not?
So it's saying, Whitney, we turn off actually, that was perfect. Right?
That was brilliant, wasn't it? I think you planned
notifications.
that. I think you planned that in advance. There you go.
So we turn them all off. So you have that time where you can really focus without your thing coming at you, in order to make sure that you're thinking about why you're doing what you're doing. So I think that's a big distraction, which is we get up and we just start doing stuff frantically, as opposed to taking that time to center and orient ourselves at the base camp of the day. And then throughout the day, I would say things like texting and email. I put my email on pause very frequently. I'll turn off my notifications on my text, and so that I have time to actually think and process and execute and get things done. So those are some of the most common and actually biggest distractions.
Yeah, they're real. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about what I do or don't do, because that's not good, but I'm working on it. Throughout the book, and indeed your podcast conversations, you bring a humanity to the conversation, talking about the personal aspects of our lives as well as professional. And I was curious in terms of how you think about S curves of being, a professional S curve and a personal one, a combined S curve, because I read an HBR article about the collateral damage of leadership roles and how you manage them. Because they can have and do have collateral damage. How do they work together? Is it one curve? Is it 2 curves? The professional and the personal?
Yeah. So I think of, it's very much a fractal. I mean, I think of our life as an S curve. Our life is a series of S curves. And at any given time, see, I need a vocal coach. At any given time, you've got this portfolio of curves. And so it could be at one time where your S curve that you're on professionally is very intense, and your S curve at home isn't so much. Things are things are moving just fine. You can have other times where your S curve at home is very intense, and so you need it to be a little bit lighter at work. And so sometimes we see this a lot with people, whether they're caring for aging parents or for children, and people will say, well, so-and-so isn't interested in growth. And I'm like, are you sure? And then you start to look at it and you realize, oh, that's because they've got this really, really intense S curve at home, which is growing them and stretching them in unimaginable ways. And so they just want to go to work and do good work, but they don't want to be stretched in unimaginable ways because they don't have the capacity to do both at the same time, because you're optimizing your portfolio of curves. The thing I would say, though, is that sometimes people will say, well, if they're not going really fast, then they're not in the sweet spot. And I would argue if people are showing up and they're doing good quality work, there is that sense of optimized tension for them personally, they're still in the sweet spot. Not everybody needs to be going to mastery at all times. So your short answer is portfolio of curves, and you're optimizing them just like you would a stock portfolio.
There we go. We link it back to where you began. The you'd hope that there would be sufficient psychological safety to have an honest conversation with the people you work with to talk about what you can give and how much you can give and when. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. But I want to delve into a little bit more about...
Sorry, David, can I just interrupt?
You can, of course.
It's so much better than it was. It's so much better than it was.
Yes.
I mean, I think about when I got pregnant with my first child, who's now 25. I mean, I did not want anybody to know. I hid it until I was like 5 months pregnant. And I just, cloak and dagger. And that it's not like that anymore. So things have gotten a lot better.
I agree.
Okay. All right. So keep going.
You talk about an action board rather than a vision board. I like the focus on action. A collection of images of the person you want to become. And you talk about nouns rather than verbs throughout the book, which I like. I'm just going to leave that there for people to, as a tease, so they have to read it. What or whom's on your action board?
Yeah. So I actually have an action board in the form of a 1 second everyday app where I have images of things that matter to me. But the big thing on my action board right now, if I'm being honest, which I'm going to be honest, is I have a sign that has a bestseller for my book that just launched. That's on my action board.
You're already there, aren't you?
Well,
you want to be the top echelon, the New York
like
Times,
on Wall Street Journal or New York Times. And so we're an Amazon bestseller. We had a wonderful, lovely launch last week. But on my action board is to be a bestseller on one of those lists. So that's something that I've been looking for information, filtering information that will make that possible, and, doing what I need to do to make that possible. I can't control whether it happens, but I can do everything in my power to make it happen.
But you have an incredible followership, let alone the quality of your content. What would being on that list give you?
It's a great question. So there are two answers to that. There's the one answer, which is, it would just be really fun to be on that list.
Why not? Why not?
Right? I mean, let's, that's the first one. The second one, and it is really the idea of, I feel so deeply and passionate about this idea of, if people have a map for what growth looks like, they're going to feel more oriented, and they're going to feel a greater sense and capacity to grow. And when you're on one of these lists, it raises the visibility of the idea.
Yes.
And if you have higher visibility, then more people will know about the idea. And one of my purposes in life, and you read it in the book, it's growth is our default setting, is I want people to be able to make progress in their lives so they can have productive, happy lives. So that's the more foundational reason for wanting the book to be on a list, is so that it gets the visibility, so that more people will read it and can grow.
That's beautiful. That's very moving. And that's a great way to close. I said I'd be sensitive and precious with your time, given everything you do. I'm a big fan. I admire your cause, and I loved reading your book and learning from it. And I'll be using all the stimulus and encouragement when I get around, because I have a pretty big S-curve in my personal life as well as, so it has to be the right timing for me. But that's been an illuminating, stimulating, enriching conversation, Whitney. Everyone knows who you are, so I'm going to ask the question anyway. But where do they find you and all your great resources, and indeed the tool, whoever they are? Where do they find you? Where can they go online?
Well, thank you for asking. So I would say the easiest place right now is to go to smartgrowthbook.com. very easy. And then you can buy the book. So that would be the first thing. And then the second thing, we're having a podcast conversation. So I would go listen to some of my podcasts and see how it is right now. The tables are turned on me and you're asking me all sorts of challenging questions, and where I have the opportunity to ask others challenging questions.
And it's a great listen, and you are a great host. Thank you, Whitney.
Thank you, David.
Was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. If you love this conversation, as I hope you did, please subscribe to the podcast and to the YouTube channel, and do check out all the other great interviews in the series. Thanks very much.